Welcome back. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching the second hour of a special edition of DD India News Hour live from New Delhi. And these are the headlines we're tracking for you at this hour. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi takes part in outreach session on artificial intelligence and energy, Africa and the Mediterranean. Says technology should be aimed at fostering progress and well-being of all. Also calls for giving priority to concerns of the global south. Pope Francis warns artificial intelligence must never be allowed to get the upper hand over humanity, stresses the need for close oversight of ever-developing technology to preserve human life and dignity. And India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi holds bilateral meetings with world leaders on the sidelines of the G7 summit. He meets French President Emmanuel Macron, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has addressed the outreach session on artificial intelligence, energy, Africa and the Mediterranean at the G7 summit in Italy on Friday. The Prime Minister expressed that it was a matter of great satisfaction for him to be attending the summit after his re-election in the largest democratic exercise of its kind in the history of humankind. He said technology should be used successfully and it had to be underpinned by a human-centric approach. In this context, he shared India's success in leveraging digital technology for public service delivery. Talking of India's AI mission premised on AI for all, the Prime Minister emphasized that this technology should be aimed at fostering progress and well-being of all. He underlined that with this broader objective, India was fostering international collaboration as a founding member of the Global Partnership for AI. He elaborated on India's energy transition pathway, noting that its approach was based on 4 A's: availability, accessibility, affordability and acceptability. He said that India was working towards achieving the target of net zero by the year 2070. Alluding to India's mission life, that is lifestyle for environment, he called upon the global community to join the tree plantation campaign launched by him on World Environment Day called Plant for Mother. He called for giving priority to the concerns of the global south and Africa in particular. The Prime Minister recalled that it was a matter of honor for India that African Union was admitted as a permanent member of the G20 under India's presidency. Now, the outreach session provides an opportunity to bring greater synergy between the outcomes of the G20 summit held under India's presidency and the ongoing G7 summit in Italy, and also deliberate on issues which are crucial for the global south. France's President Emmanuel Macron, in his address, praised Prime Minister Modi's initiative on artificial intelligence and digital public infrastructure. Meanwhile, Pope Francis joined on Friday the outreach session of the G7 Leaders Summit in Italy to lead discussions on artificial intelligence. It's the first time in history that a pontiff has taken part in a meeting of the group of 7 democracies. The group comprises Britain, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, the United States and the European Union. Pope Francis was warmly embraced by a fellow Argentinian President Javier Milei and kissed by Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He also received a hug from Jordan's King Abdullah II and had a long whispered conversation with US President Joe Biden. Besides, he also met with India's Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi. The G7 outreach session on artificial intelligence was also attended by Pope Francis. He said humans must not lose control of artificial intelligence.
And protect a space for meaningful human control over the process of choosing artificial intelligence programs. Human dignity itself depends on it. Precisely on this issue, let me insist. In a drama such as armed conflicts, it is urgent to rethink the development and use of devices such as so-called lethal autonomous weapons in order to ban their use, starting already with a proactive and concrete effort to introduce more and more meaningful human control. No machine should ever choose whether to take the life of a human being.
And joining me is a very special guest. I have with me Mr. Manjeev Puri. He is a former Indian ambassador to Nepal, the European Union, Belgium and Luxembourg. He is also a former deputy permanent representative of India to the United Nations in New York. Ambassador Puri, welcome to this special broadcast. First up, your key takeaways from the Prime Minister of India's intervention there at the G7 outreach session.
Ramesh, thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Welcome.
I think the visit itself is significant. First, let's underscore what the Prime Minister himself said. Coming as India's Prime Minister after the largest electoral exercise in human history. It are the world's largest country, the fifth largest economy in the world, but our commitment to democracy. This is, as you know, particularly important to the G7, which is the grouping of the largest economies of the world, but all of whom profess democracy and are deeply wedded to this. So this was particularly important. Now let's look at the session. The session was at the outreach session where India was there. Some others from the G20 were also present out there. But interestingly, we had Pope Francis, as you said, joining a G7 summit for the first time. I saw the president of the World Bank was also present there, and so were other leaders out there. This is a unique opportunity where you have this chance of being able to interact with the world's most powerful leaders, talk to them, especially after you've been reappointed the third term, and underscore India's realities in India's situation and how India is a force for global good. Secondly, let's also understand this, and you pointed this out in your report. We interacted closely with Japan when it held the presidency of the G7 last year, the year in which we hosted the G20 summit. But after our summit, where a number of path-breaking decisions and initiatives were taken, including on biofuels, on global digital public infrastructure, and so on and so forth, it is important that we reached out again to the G7 because these are again countries which, like us, are democracies, but are important stakeholders in framing a world order and in taking things forward in an equitable manner, which looks at development as well as ecology, sustainability, and all that happens. Now, this was an important session dealing with artificial intelligence. It also spoke about issues dealing with Africa, the entire set of issues about technology and technological innovation. Indians, we all know, are in the lead. Look at the MDs of some of the most important companies in the IT world. They're all people from India who studied in India. But India itself is becoming a major player. What we did with the India Stack, the apps that we developed during COVID, and what we've done with the digital public infrastructure, all of this are eye-openers for the world and particularly important for the developing world also to see, and our offer for all of them. So all in all, I must say, very important and significant for India, the presence of the Prime Minister, meeting counterparts and leaders from the largest economies in the world, but also showcasing India and its capacities and capabilities and willingness to be a partner, a force for good for the world.
Ambassador Puri, you have the benefit of having handled India's bilateral and multilateral relations. during your time in the Indian Foreign Service. Now, as they say, sometimes what happens on the margins of a summit becomes equally important. In that context, how do you interpret or analyze or look or view the Prime Minister's bilaterals, including with those of France, the UK, and most importantly, Ukraine?
You're absolutely right, Ramesh, in asking me this question. France and UK, we can all understand. We have ongoing and massive bilateral relations with them. The Prime Minister knows them personally. And, this was a way of saying, look, I'm back. We will take our things forward. With the UK, the FTA, with France, so many bilateral agreements, including in the areas of defense cooperation, etc. Meeting the Italian Prime Minister, who's the host, was obviously there, and taking things forward on the India-Europe, including India-EU things, was very much there. But remember, President Zelensky didn't come to Delhi for the G20 summit. Perhaps this was the only time in the last 2 years he wasn't present at any major, at a major international event, having the world's most important leaders present. Whatever may be the reasons for that. It was important also to reach out. Because, this is a constituency. There is a set of issues there. And we have been in touch with Ukraine. We are also in touch with Russia. And the Prime Minister has repeatedly underlined, of course, I repeat what was said many years back, that this is not the era of war. But the fact is, looking at dialogue, looking at ways of doing things, but at the same time underscoring India's bilateral relations, including with Ukraine. Remember, we had more than 20,000 students in Ukraine when the conflict broke out. We have old relations with them, including in the defense industry piece. So it was important that this meeting happened, unless somebody felt that, India has sort of, in a sense, distanced itself from Ukraine. No, that's not the case. India is involved, wants to wish that ways and means are found such that there is peace which prevails, and that the conflict, whatever may be the reasons for it, there is a resolution and a peaceful resolution. Remember also that there is a peace summit taking place in Switzerland soon after this. Mm-hmm. And, there are certain hopes. I'm not going to go beyond that because, the Russians are not there. There are so many other sets of issues in that. But the fact of the matter is, at least some kind of a dialogue on trying to find a way forward on this conflict is beginning. That's something that is important, and it was important for the Prime Minister also to, meet with one of the principal stakeholders, the President of Poland, in this context.
Mr. Puri, so we've discussed about Prime Minister Modi's address to the outreach session at the G7 summit. We've discussed about Prime Minister's bilaterals on the margins of the summit. Now, if I might go back to the substantive agenda of the G7 summit in particular, we are given to understand that while we are waiting for a joint statement to be released, the twin issues of migration and unfair trade practices by China and its belligerent moves in the wider Indo-Pacific region formed a substantive chunk of the discussions by the G7 leaders among themselves. What do you make of this renewed focus on China's activities in our neighborhood in particular, as well as the issue of migration that poses a challenge for Europe in particular?
Ramesh, look, when this concept of the G7 countries, at that time, in fact, they were G8, when they started the concept of outreach, China was perhaps the most important outreach partner.
Right.
And look, it has happened only in the last 2-3 years, in a sense, in the context in the wake of COVID, but a realization among the Western publics that things with China were not really hunky-dory. There were tremendous economic opportunities. They'd reaped the benefits, but it appeared that the Chinese were getting the better of those things. There were other issues, and you rightly pointed out the Indo-Pacific as an example, hegemonistic issues of the Chinese government and the Chinese leadership. These all don't fit well with Western democracies, the United States, not just because of global power play business, but the way they are structured, and believers in various kinds of freedoms, democracy, and so on and so forth. The right to navigation, all of those things. Each of these things is equally dear and important as far as we are concerned. So, this particular focus on China is important. You can't let China slip off in this sort of a manner, no matter that the G7 is taking place in Europe. And let's be very clear, China is a very important, indeed critical trading partner for the Europeans, for the Germans, by far. I mean, we are big trading partners of the EU, but the Chinese EU relationship is about 5 times our size. So, given these facts and the fact that the Europeans have their own sets of dependencies and relationships vis-a-vis China, they have to find ways and means of being able to deal with this particular rise of China, if you say, no longer something that you can call a simple friendly rise, but a rise which has challenges, confrontations, and so on. And so it is important. Now, in the context of India, let us be clear, we do have an issue. We have a straightforward matter of a border issue, which is a very serious national security issue. But you know, India is also a huge trading partner with China. China is our largest trading partner. And decouple, de-risk, all those words we've used. But the fact is that businesses and their dependencies on China continues to remain. But if the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese, the largest economies in the world, are focused on China, then it's possible. I don't seem to have or wouldn't like to convey any kind of hope, because the Chinese are also hell-bent in their own hegemonistic ambitions. There is certain possibilities of, let me say, a kind of via media that, look, there should be respect for a certain amount of international rules and regulations. We do business in terms of quote-unquote fair trade practices. We maintain sustainability. All that is important. But at the end of the day, you know, the rise of the Chinese economy, and if it goes on, is certainly a matter of contestation as far as the West is concerned, not just India, which has a border issue.
Right. Ambassador Puri, do stay on. I'll come back to you momentarily. Let me go across to my colleague Giles Gibson, who is joining us from Italy for more on the ongoing G7 Outreach Summit. Giles, good to have you back on the broadcast. Any word yet on a joint statement, Giles?
Still no word yet on that joint statement, Ramesh. The day 2 of talks starting to wrap up, and really a sense here that the critical items have now been discussed, and they're just trying to sort of dot the I's and cross the T's in terms of what exactly is going to be in this joint statement. The US President Joe Biden also set to fly out at the end of day 2 as well, so that perhaps giving a sense of urgency to getting this joint statement together. We have had some draft statements leaking to the press over the last few hours or so. Lots of lines, including language on fossil fuels that environmentalists are saying is not quite strong enough, and also some very tough language in these draft statements when it comes to China and the G7's concerns about what they describe as industrial overcapacity.
Right. Why don't you, in the meantime, Giles, also talk to our viewers about the G7 officially, we are given to understand, endorsing a deal on how to use the interest from Russian frozen assets to fund Ukraine's war machine against Russia.
Yeah, that was the real breakthrough of the first day of the summit, this deal that's been months and months in terms of negotiations between particularly the Europeans and the Americans. What we heard from the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who's hosting these talks at the end of day 1, was that a political agreement had been reached to issue this $50 billion loan to the Ukrainians using the interest, the profits from frozen Russian assets in the West. What we've been hearing is that this money will arrive in Kyiv by the end of 2024, but they still need to iron out some technical details because, of course, these frozen Russian assets are held in different legal jurisdictions around the world. So technical experts are going to have to go through the sort of fine details of this before they can actually start getting that money together and get it to the Ukrainians, where it's really desperately needed as they continue their fight against the full-scale Russian invasion.
Giles, thank you for the updates. Appreciate it. Giles Gibson reporting there from Italy on the G7 summit. Right, going back to my guest, Ambassador Manjeev Puri, who is still with us. Ambassador Puri, I was talking to my colleague Giles Gibson there in Italy, and I was asking him about one key outcome from the G7 summit this year, where the G7 has officially endorsed a deal on how to use the interest from frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's war effort against Russia. That plus a new security pact, a 10-year pact signed between the Ukraine and the US on the sidelines of the G7 summit as well. How do you look at these twin developments?
Ramesh, let me comment on them in a disjointed manner.
Sure.
Look, the support for Ukraine, or let me say the support to counter Russia, is something which is now, let me say for the moment at least, strongly embedded in the transatlantic partnership. You would have heard a few days back Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, going to Hungary and agreeing with the Hungarian Prime Minister that Hungary, which is a NATO member, could stay out, but Hungary would not stop NATO from actually taking much more aggressive action in terms of Russia and Ukraine. You've heard of the issue of allowing the Ukrainians to hit targets in Russia. Obviously, that means weapons from the West. Now, President Biden, a couple of days back, had mentioned that the idea of this security pact was mentioned by him at the last G7 summit. Many countries have come together, basically countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and allies category. And this time the Americans themselves have signed. Remember what a bit of heavy lifting it took in the US Congress and in the Senate to get the aid bill passed by which monies could flow to Ukraine, despite all the large number of people all wanting to support Ukraine. So, there is a domestic politics angle to it. There is this particular angle about countering Russia. And today the West seems absolutely determined that, no go to Russia under any circumstance. And that's exactly what we are saying. The Swiss peace conference, the Russians not being invited. Now, coming to the sanctions, some 300 odd new sanctions have been released by the US Department of Treasury, looking again at financials. We are seeing a new level of weaponization of financial transactions, the use of the dollar, etc. But look at this. It's Russian interest, and it is what is being used to be given to the Ukrainians. How about some money coming from your own coffers?
Right.
Look, I'm not saying this is wrong. Look, this is the way powers interact, and this is precisely what is happening. Right or wrong is a different matter. But the fact of the matter is, here was Russian investments which have benefited these countries, obviously earned interest for the Russians. That interest is now being used to counter the Russians. Well, that's also a new element, or perhaps a redoing of elements which used to be used in the past in different forms. But the fact is, the West is strong and secure in its will to counter Russia. And I say this in a specific context. The European Parliament had recently held elections, and the far-right groups have done reasonably well. I mean, they are not going to be in the majority. The majority remains with the centrist parties, the center-right and the center-left. But the far-right groups, including some who didn't want to take very strong anti-Russian positions, who found that this support was becoming too much for Ukraine and that it was affecting European economies, etc., etc. All that is something that we need to also remember has just happened. In fact, both Chancellor Scholz and the French president have not performed very well in the European elections in their own countries. Given this particular thing, whatever anyone may have thought in terms of Ukraine and the support for it, this particular G7 summit makes it very clear. Not only is it policy continue, but to the extent that they can, it will be policy hard. They recognize that Ukraine is facing a difficult problem. They have huge shortages of manpower in their army. They are now even opening up to recruit people who are being paroled, who are in jail, etc. They are facing huge shortage of critical weapons and so on. Whatever may be the cause for that. But the West is stepping up to the extent it can within the limitations of its own legal and parliamentary resources. But they are quite firm in their resolve to counter Russia.
All right, I will leave it at that. Ambassador Puri, thank you once again for joining us and sharing your thoughts and insights with our viewers at home and abroad. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. All right, we are now joined by another guest, a French journalist and historian, Francois Gauthier from Paris. He is a French journalist based in India who served as South Asia correspondent for reputed French newspapers as well. Mr. Gauthier, welcome to this special broadcast. Good to have you join on this discussion. Now, first up, we've just heard India's Prime Minister Modi delivering an address at an outreach session of the G7 summit on artificial intelligence, energy, Africa and the Mediterranean. But I want to ask you about, take any issue facing the world today, be it pandemic, be it security, be it the Indo-Pacific, meaning China, be it climate change or world economy. India, do you think, is become indispensable to some of these issues?
Yes, I think so. And I think it is owed to Mr. Prime Minister Modi to have put India on the world map during all these meetings and all these interaction with different Western leaders like Mr. Biden, Mr. Macron, the Italian President, Giorgia Meloni, who, as you know, has done very well in the last European election.
Right.
The gentleman who was speaking before me was highlighting that, and I think it's very important that they're now saying that Mrs. Meloni is the queen maker in Europe, because what they call the far right, and she's supposed to be a far-right lady, has done very well in the European elections, mainly because of the immigration problem that Europe is facing a huge amount of legal and illegal immigrants, and she has been very strongly advocating against the opening of the European doors to immigrants. So Mr. Modi is doing very well, I think, and in that meeting, not only with Mrs. Meloni, but also with my president, Mr. Macron, and various leaders. He has put forward India's position and is placing India in a strategic manner without, there are certain issues like Gaza and Ukraine, where the Prime Minister showed his openness to dialogue, but without actually committing India on certain issues like Ukraine and Gaza, which I think are very difficult and very tricky issues. So he's doing very well, and I'm admiring his statesmanship.
Mr. Gauthier, I'll come to the Modi-Macron bilateral in just a bit, but I want to ask you about another issue that much of the world is grappling with. While we are waiting for the joint statement from the G7 summit to be released, we're given to understand that two twin issues. One, as you mentioned, migration. The other was China and the Indo-Pacific at large. The European Commission chief Ursula von der Leyen saying that the EU and the G7 in particular are concerned about what she calls unfair trade practices by China, and that China's overcapacity is a global concern, and that G7 leaders will coordinate their responses on this issue going forward. How do you look at this renewed focus on China's activities in the region and beyond at this year's G7 summit?
I've been writing for at least 10, 15 years that the West is going to look at India in a different way because of China. Because India is the only country that can, that can stand across, and oppose China's thirst for hegemony, both on the land. As you know, China is doing a new Silk Road across the Himalayas and wanting to flood Europe and the West with its goods, and also on the sea. I think the issue of the China Sea and the Indian Ocean is a very, very important issue, and the US and Europe are worried that China is slowly encroaching and slowly having a very strong naval presence in sea passages, which are very important for the world trade. So India, finally, the West is recognizing that India is a very important geostrategical partner, very, very important geostrategical partner, because it is as big as China. There are as many Indians as there are Chinese, and of course the Indian military has the teeth to stand and to counter China. So in this particular meet, in that G7 meet, there has been more recognition of India's role as a buffer to China, not the economic buffer, but military buffer, eventually nuclear buffer on the land and on the sea. And I have been saying that for a long time. And I've been telling my country, France, that look at India in a different manner. Look at India as a geostrategical partner. And I think Mr. Macron has understood it. And we have a lot of talk about the strategical partnership between India and France, which, of course, as you know, there are submarines, there are Rafale land planes and seaplanes. So a lot of things are happening between France and India, which I'm happy about.
Indeed. Let me now, since you mentioned the strategic aspects of India's ties with European countries and France in particular, let's talk a bit at some length on India-France ties in the bilateral and multilateral context, Mr. Gautier. President Macron, for his part, has praised India's and Prime Minister Modi's emphasis on artificial intelligence and digital public infrastructure in his remarks at the G7 Outreach Summit. How do you read the chemistry and the convergence of interest between the two countries, India and France, and their leaders, Mr. Modi and Mr. Macron in particular?
But as you know, the market of artificial intelligence in India is huge, not only because India has a tremendous amount of manpower, of software engineers, both in India and abroad, not so much in France, but in the US, I think. The software engineers are the biggest numbers are Indians, but also because India is going to need a lot of artificial intelligence. So I saw today that they are saying that $8 billion is the projected figure of the market value of India in 2025. 40% of the artificial intelligence world trade will happen in India. So again, the West is recognizing the importance of India, not only in terms of economic partner, but in terms of intelligence, because artificial intelligence, after all, is all about intelligence of human beings who are programming, software, so as to help in so many fields today. And I think this intelligence is in India with Indians, and the West is recognizing that. As far as the strategic partnership between India and France, I'm a Frenchman living in India. I love India. I'm a defender of India. I wish it would be more. I wish it would be more. There are always, big statements from Mr. Macron and Mr. Modi about the partnership. But in terms of industry, in terms of French investment in India, I wish it would be more, because the French have a lot of know-how in infrastructure, which India needs very badly, both metros as well as roads and aviation. So I wish it to be more, but I think it's happening, and slowly it's happening. So I'm very happy that the strategic partnership between France and India is developing, and maybe during that meeting some more agreements will be either inked or signed. So yes, it's very important that India and France collaborate together on many fields, not only cultural, because for a long time, as a Frenchman living in India, I have seen these cultural programs, that France is hosting, in Paris, and India is hosting in Delhi and different cities. But this is not so important. What is important is economy, that France and India partners together in economy, that the French invest in India, that more and more students come to France and study in France and learn French, so that they come back, and these ties grow bigger. And I think it's happening now finally. So I'm happy about it.
Why not? And here I'd like to take a moment, Mr. Gautier, with your permission, to give some context for our viewers on India-France ties. Strategic autonomy is a phrase often used in India by Indians, by policymakers and diplomats alike. And in my recollection, my reckoning, the only other country which swears by strategic autonomy is France. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Gautier. And by the way, India and France celebrated the 25 years of their strategic partnership just last year. India-France ties straddle a number of areas, be it defense, civil nuclear energy, space, and so on. And this was, by the way, the first strategic partnership ever for India to sign with any country in the world. So in that context, Mr. Gautier, what's your wish list insofar as India-France ties go?
So my first wish list is that, for the French to invest more in India, both on a high level and both, locally, because small French industries, I live partly in Pondicherry, and I see that in Pondicherry there are some, French small industries investing there, but as well as big industries. I think that there has to be more liberalization of the Indian economy, because there are hurdles in terms of visa, in terms of FCRA, in terms of banking, where Westerners, French in particular, find it difficult to invest in India. And of course, between each state, there are different rules. So if you invest in Tamil Nadu, you have central rules, and you have Tamil Nadu rules. So it's very complicated. So I think Mr. Modi started this, and I hope he's going to continue in his third term to kind of unify, all the structures of investment so that it's easier to invest in India. Which, I have some friends who invest in China, French people, and they tell me that, it's much easier in China. Of course, China is not a democracy like India, so it makes it easier. So I am expecting that on the one hand, India liberalize the investment structure, and on the other hand, the French take more interest in India, because unfortunately, of course, Mr. Macron is, is a paragon of friendship for India. But in terms of the French Indologists who speak about India, in terms of the books that are, written in France about India, we always find the same things about caste, about Hindu fundamentalism, about, even Mr. Modi being a dangerous man, or the BJP being a dangerous man, which are absolutely untrue, and which have been fighting for so long, not very successfully, I must say, because it is still there. So the French have to look differently at India, not only Mr. Macron, but the French intelligentsia, the French diplomats, the French businessmen, and particularly the French Indologists, because there's a school of Indology in France which is very hostile to India and which is harming French-India relationship. We had a lunch in Paris with, I will not name him, but with an Indian diplomat in Paris, and he told us, that it is difficult because these French Indologists, which, by the way, are sponsored by the French government, are always, harming India, always hostile to India. So there has to be an effort on both sides. On the Indian side, make it easier to invest for the French in India. On the French side, to look at India more positively.
I would have loved to continue this conversation, Mr. Gautier, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I will have to leave it at that. May I thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts and insights with our viewers at home and abroad. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Now, after a first day of dominated by Ukraine, US President Joe Biden and the leaders of Japan, Italy, France, Germany, Canada and the UK opened the second day of the G7 summit in Italy with talks on migration. The talks also focused on the Indo-Pacific, including fair trade with China, the world's second largest economy.
Migration, China and artificial intelligence topped the agenda of the concluding day of discussions at the G7 summit in Italy. The group of 7 nations vowed on Friday to tackle what they called unfair business practices by China that were undermining their workers and industries, according to a draft statement on the final day of the annual summit. The G7 also warned of action against Chinese financial institutions that helped Russia obtain weaponry for its war against Ukraine. G7 leaders gathered for a roundtable on migration, with Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni pushing Europe to help her curb the illegal flows from Africa. The summit saw a historic appearance by Pope Francis to discuss artificial intelligence. The Pope was joined by heads of state and government, including India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. On the margins of the summit, the presidents of the US and Ukraine signed a 10-year bilateral security agreement that aims to bolster Ukraine's defenses. The pact commits future US governments to supporting Ukraine by helping it develop its outdated armed forces.
President Zelensky and I have just now signed that agreement between the United States and Ukraine. Our goal is to strengthen Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capabilities for the long term. The United States is going to help ensure that Ukraine can do both, not by sending American troops to fight in Ukraine, but by providing weapons and ammunition, expanding intelligence sharing, continuing to train brave Ukrainian troops at bases in Europe and the United States, enhancing interoperability between our militaries in line with NATO standards, investing in Ukraine's defense industrial base, so in time, they can supply their own weapons and munitions.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky called the agreement historic. He said it is a bridge towards Ukraine's eventual NATO membership.
Today is a truly historic day, and we have signed the strongest agreement between Ukraine and the US since our independence. And this is something that will not only provide security, but also new good jobs for Ukrainians and Americans. The issue of NATO is covered through the text of the agreement. It states that America supports Ukraine's future membership in NATO and recognizes that our security agreement is a bridge to Ukraine's membership in NATO.
Canada will now host the next G7 summit in 2025. Bureau Report, DD India.
And in some more updates from the G7 summit, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni welcomed Pope Francis to the summit. The Pope is making an appearance at a G7 summit for the first time ever. G7 leaders and Pope Francis discussed about how to govern artificial intelligence and harness it for growth. Artificial intelligence has become a major geopolitical talking point among G7 leaders ever since the so-called generative AI captured the public's imagination in late 2022. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi held a bilateral meeting with France's President Emmanuel Macron on the margins of the G7 summit in Italy. The two leaders reviewed India-France bilateral relations, focusing on Horizon 2047 roadmap as well as a roadmap for the Indo-Pacific. Both leaders agreed to expand cooperation in the realms of artificial intelligence, critical and emerging technologies, energy and sports. The two leaders will also work closely in the context of the forthcoming AI Summit and the United Nations Oceans Conference, both to be hosted in France in 2025. The two leaders also exchanged views on key global and regional issues, emphasizing on a strong and trusted strategic partnership. India's Prime Minister also extended his best wishes to President Macron for the forthcoming Paris Olympic and Paralympic Games. Well, let me go across to my colleague Amritpal Singh one more time on this special broadcast. Amrit, if you can hear me and you're with us, tell us more about the Prime Minister's engagements as we speak. Has he already met with the leaders of Germany and Italy?
No, there is a family photograph of all the G7 leaders and the outreach partners, G7 partners, that's currently going on at Borgo in Nazia, the venue of the summit. After this finishes, in a little while, he heads for the bilateral meetings, which happen at the same venue on the sidelines. He'll first meet with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He then has a extended bilateral with Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. Then he has the bilateral with the UAE President, and the last bilateral he'll meet Prime Minister Fumio Kishida of Japan before he planes for Delhi. So that's what the rest of the day for him looks like, Ramesh.
Amrit, having spent the last few days in Italy and covering the summit from very close quarters, looking back at the developments over the last couple of days in Italy and especially in light of India's interventions in the outreach summit, how would you recap or characterize or describe India's interventions at the G7 this year?
It was a very short visit, Ramesh, just a day long visit. He arrived in the wee hours of today, spent the whole day, engaging bilaterally with world leaders. He's already met the three world leaders, the French president, the British prime minister, and the Ukrainian president. And then he had an intervention at the outreach session on artificial intelligence, energy, Africa, and the Mediterranean. And then he has a bilateral schedule later for later. But I would say it was a very hectic, a very fast-paced day for him. I would say that it was he was able to put across both individually to the leaders that he met and at the intervention that he made that the world is changing. The G7 has to factor in the priorities or the concerns of the global south. And looking forward, technology needs to be used for the betterment of people, their lives, lifting them out of poverty, if challenges of climate change, all kind of challenges, poverty, climate change, priorities of the global south, be it in terms of energy, supply chain disruptions, or food security. So all that has to be factored in when you decide the global agenda, because large parts of the world's population lives in these countries, and they are the most vulnerable because of the economic status of the economies that they live in. So those who are more fortunate, like the G7, need to shoulder that responsibility and need to work together with them rather than having a traditional approach of a non-donorship. So I think that was the central takeaway, the key takeaway from his visit. Of course, he discussed specifics with individual leaders related to the bilateral relations between India and their countries and the countries of those he met. But if you look at his intervention at the outreach session, it was essentially concerns of the global south using technology, AI for everybody's betterment. He gave examples of how India successfully used that, and that was seconded by world leaders like President Macron and also President Biden, saying that when President Biden in his intervention spoke about India, Brazil, and Argentina being important partners from mineral partners. So I think that I would say is what he was able to achieve in his day-long visit there.
Right, we have a few more minutes left on this broadcast, Amrit. So very quickly, if you will, one of the bilaterals that we forgot to discuss at some length was Prime Minister Modi's bilateral with President of Ukraine, President Zelensky. How did that meeting go?
I think that was a very important bilateral, and he was able to meet President Zelensky in very relaxed settings. I mean, India has balanced this very, very well between the Western Bloc and its relationship with Russia when it came to purchasing oil, and he was able to effectively communicate to the West that why it was important for the Indians to engage with the Russians, and the West understood that and wanted, in fact, encourage India keeping the door ajar, so that whenever according to them is the stage for building relations back, and once things cool down, India could play an important role in that. And I think when he told President Zelensky, he first listened to President Zelensky on the situation. Then he was pretty open about the fact, and that he conveyed it to him that finally you'll have to come down and sit on the table. So dialogue and diplomacy is the way forward. But he was, he wished luck to President Zelensky, who I hear has just reached Switzerland for that peace conference on Ukraine. Whether that is successful or not, we'll get to know in the next couple of days, or whatever is achieved there. So while, in his meeting with President Zelensky, and I think from President Zelensky's body language also, you could understand that while he was here to tell the G7 that they need more weaponry, they need more money in the war or conflict, whatever adjective we use for it, with Russia, his meeting with taking out time and meeting Prime Minister, because he was here just for a day, and meeting Prime Minister Modi, the importance that they attach to the role India can play, and given the fact that India's, it's not as if India's playing both sides. India's been quite a voice of reason. The Prime Minister had told the Russian President the same, the Ukrainian President the same, and India's taken a very reasoned position on that. Now it is up to the Western Bloc and primarily Ukraine, though backed by the Western Bloc, to see when they see the time ripe for any kind of rapprochement. But I think so. That was a pretty interesting development of the day, the meeting between President Zelensky and Prime Minister Modi. Ramesh.
Amrit, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. That was Amrit Pal Singh reporting on the G7 Outreach Summit from Italy. Let me quickly recap the India-Ukraine meeting for you again. The Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, held talks with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Both leaders had a productive meeting in which they discussed ways to strengthen bilateral relations. They also exchanged views on the situation in Ukraine and the upcoming summit on peace being hosted by Switzerland. The Prime Minister conveyed that India continues to encourage peaceful resolution of the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy, and he reiterated that India would continue to do everything within its means to support a peaceful solution. And with that, it's a wrap on this special 2-hour edition of DD India News Up. For those of you on the go, you can get all the latest news and updates on the DD India mobile app. It's available on both Android and iOS platforms. You can scan the QR code on the screen now to download it. Okay, so let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. You can connect with us on Facebook, X and Instagram. You can also check out our website ddindia.co.in. We will be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran. From all of us here in New Delhi, thanks for watching DD India News Up.